Okay, so this parsha is a fascinating parsha. It discusses how Joseph rises to power. If we left off last week, Joseph was sort of at the bottom, the lowest point he can ever reach. First of all, he was kidnapped by his brothers and sold as a slave, and then in the home of his master, he became successful. But then his master's wife accused him of trying to seduce her, and then Joseph was put in prison, and Joseph in prison meets two of Pharaoh's ministers, and he interprets their dreams. And he's hoping one of them is killed and one of them is restored to his position in Pharaoh's palace. And Joseph is hoping that now that means that he has an ally in the Pharaoh's palace. And Joseph asks him and says, please mention me to Pharaoh and say that I was taken away from my land, the land of the Hebrews, and I was placed here unjustly. And Joseph now finally has something to hope for. But the reality is that the Torah says the Saramashkim, the butler, Pharaoh's butler, forgot about Joseph. And now Joseph is in prison for another 2 years. And like often happens, God steps in to help when a person loses all hope from anything else. In other words, as long as somebody is relying on a natural means of salvation, then he doesn't really turn to God. Only after Joseph really has no hope left, that's when God creates this turnaround. Now, this turnaround is very quick. It's not gradual. Immediately, Pharaoh has the dreams. Pharaoh is troubled. The butler remembers Joseph and says, Joseph is the one who can interpret dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams and gets the dream job, pun intended, gets the dream job of being the second in command to Pharaoh. And that's where the story unfolds. And there's the great famine, and the brothers have to come down to buy grain. And eventually Joseph accuses them of being spies. And finally, next week, we get to the reunion between the brothers. So it's a fascinating parsha with a lot of details and lots of fascinating points to ponder. So we'll begin the journey as we usually do with the parsha in a nutshell. And then if we have time, God willing, we'll be able to drill and dig a little deeper to some of the points. So the parsha in a nutshell reads as follows. Parashas Miketz, which means the end. It's the end of the 2-year period after Joseph has interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's ministers. So Joseph's imprisonment finally ends when Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows that are swallowed up by the 7 lean cows, and of 7 fat ears of grain swallowed by 7 lean ears. Joseph interprets the dreams to mean that the 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of hunger, and advises Pharaoh to store grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh appoints Joseph governor of Egypt. Joseph marries Asnat, daughter of Potiphar, and they have 2 sons, Menashe and Ephraim. So he goes from prison to becoming the second in command, almost instantaneous. Second paragraph, famine spreads throughout the region, and food can be obtained only in Egypt. 10 of Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to purchase grain. The youngest Benjamin stays home, for Jacob fears for his safety. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, insists that they bring Benjamin to prove that they are who they are who they say they are, and imprisons Shimon, as a hostage. Later, they discover that the money they paid for their provisions has been mysteriously returned to them, because Joseph has his people plant the money that they bought the provisions, planted it back in their bags. Jacob agrees to send Benjamin only after Judah assumes personal and eternal responsibility for him. This time, Joseph receives them kindly, releases Simon, and invites them to an eventful dinner at his home. But then he plants his silver goblet, purportedly imbued with magic powers, in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers set out for home the next morning, they are pursued, searched, and arrested when the goblet is discovered. Joseph offers to set them free and retain only Benjamin as his slave. And this is the big cliffhanger. This is where the portion ends. Next week, we read how Joseph approaches Judah, Judah approaches Joseph, and they have a conversation, and that conversation causes Joseph to reveal his identity. Now, what is Joseph trying to do with the brothers? Why is he accusing them as being slaves? There's a lot to talk about. But before we get to the second half of the parsha, we want to get to the first half of the parsha. And we want to figure out what is going on here. Because like the Abarbanel says, he says, this interpretation that Joseph offers is a simple interpretation. Any child can come up with it. How could it be that all the professional dream interpreters in Egypt, and in Egypt is a whole industry, there are schools for dream interpretation, because they were into all kinds of ideas of magic and witchcraft and dream interpretation. So they were professional dream interpreters. How is it possible that all the dream interpreters dropped the ball and they don't offer the most straightforward, simple interpretation of the dream? What's the dream? The dream happens at the Nile. What is the Nile? The Nile is the sustenance of all of Egypt. There is no rain in Egypt. They get their sustenance from the Nile. Fat cows means there's food to graze. Skinny cows means there's no food to graze. Fat ears means the grain is good. Skinny ears means the grain is bad. What's the big deal? How is it that nobody could figure out this interpretation, and Joseph is the only one who can? And that's one question. And the bigger question is, just because he gets this interpretation, first of all, Joseph was asked to interpret a dream, not to give advice. Joseph gives the interpretation, but then starts telling the Pharaoh how to run the economy. It's very strange. Imagine he's a slave, he's a prisoner out of prison. So he's a dream interpreter. So do your expertise and interpret the dream, but not to start creating policy, telling Pharaoh what to do. Now Pharaoh should gather grain and store it in the 7 years of plenty for the 7 years of the famine. That is something that he wasn't called to do. It's very strange that he does so. It's also strange that Pharaoh now gives him the job. Just because you're a good dream interpreter doesn't mean you're a good administrator, doesn't mean you're a good ruler. But something is so amazing about Joseph's interpretation that Pharaoh says, wow, I've never met anyone like you. Pharaoh says this, he tells his ministers, have we ever seen a man with the spirit of God in him like this boy, like this person? It's like, what's the big deal? It's a simple dream. It's a simple interpretation. Why do all the experts drop the ball and Joseph alone is the one who can come up with the correct interpretation? So that's an intriguing question, but the purpose of the question is to get us into the deeper interpretation and to get to the picture of what's really happening here in the story. But in the meantime, if anybody has any suggestions or questions or comments or jokes, please don't hesitate to share. Otherwise, we continue.
Rabbi, a quick question on something towards the end. From the nutshell, it describes the goblet as having magical powers.
That's what Joseph says.
Where does that come from? Is that directly taken from the Parsha?
Yes. Joseph tells the brothers, how could you take my goblet if I am the one, if my goblet has magic powers of guessing? In other words, it has magical powers of giving me information. And what the Torah describes, and Rashi fills in the details, that when they come to his home, Joseph is playing with them. When they come to his home, Joseph invites them to his home, and he sits them down, and he sits the older one, he sits them in the order of age. How does he know the order of age? So he tells them, it's my goblet. Of course, he's their brother. He knows the order of age. Now, you have to understand, there are 10 brothers, but they're not far out in age. All 10 brothers were born in about 6 years. All 10 brothers were born in even less, between 7 or 10 years. I don't remember offhand, because remember, there are 4 wives, right? So they're relatively close in age. It's not one woman, it's not one mother. There are 4 mothers. So he comes and he makes this whole spiel where I can look at my goblet and I could see who's older and who's younger. He's playing with them. He's trying to give them hints that he does know who they are, but they're oblivious. So now when Joseph, part of the game, Joseph is like, I'm an Egyptian. I'm into witchcraft. I'm into guessing. I'm into all these magical powers, because that was Egypt was known for. So he's part of the part. Joseph is playing the part by saying, my goblet helps me guess. He's playing the part of the Egyptian.
So he doesn't really believe that. He's just saying it.
No, of course not. He knows that he knows their age because he's their brother, not because of
Okay.
the goblets, right?
Thank you. I'm going to put away my Harry Potter magic wand now. Just
Okay.
concerned there for a second.
Rabbi, it's interesting, just a teeny observation. When the Bible says that he forgot about Joseph, it was very unlikely that this particular man who just got away with his life would dare suggest anything to Pharaoh, would bring anything up to Pharaoh until it became something that could help Pharaoh. So the story starts out slanted.
Against the minister. Look, the Torah uses a double language in last week's parsha. It says velo zachar Sarah mashkim et Yosef. Sarah mashkim, the butler didn't remember Joseph, and he forgot him. Right? Double language. It says he didn't remember and he forgot, which means it's not like the butler was waiting for an opportunity to raise it with Pharaoh. Remember, he's the butler. Pharaoh, what did Pharaoh do a whole day? He didn't run the economy. For that, he had Joseph. You know what he did? He ate and he drank. It's actually, I think this is comical. We know there are three ministers of Pharaoh's kingdom that the Torah mentions. You ready? Sarah Mashkim is the butler. Butler doesn't sound good enough. The minister of the drinks, the minister of the baking, and the minister of the slaughtering the cows. These are the three ministers. It says Sar, three ministers that we read in last week's parsha. The person who originally purchased Joseph was the minister of the slaughtering. We assume it means slaughtering meat, but some people say it's the executioner. We don't know. But the bottom line is Pharaoh is obviously obsessed with food. Okay, so all day long he's eating and he's drinking. So if you're the butler, you have a lot of power in that palace. But putting that aside, let's assume that the butler was sitting and waiting for an opportunity to raise it. The Torah says no. It says a double language. He didn't remember and he forgot him, which means the person totally forgot, which happens often. Sometimes people are helped by others, and it takes humility to be thankful. And people with an ego don't want to be thankful. So instead, they block it out. They block out the benefactors. They block out the remembering people who have done things for them along the way. So it seems to me that that's what the Torah is saying with the double language last week's parsha. He didn't remember and he forgot. Now,
That makes sense. Yeah. Now, there was let's see, one other thing. If you watch a lot of television, as I do, you know what was happening in the courts of Egypt at the time, how many people in high places were assassinated. I mean, within the ruling caste, there was such antagonism, and there was slaughter, and there was all kinds of things going on that it's not surprising that that the Pharaoh would choose an outsider that he could control, that had no influence with the rest of the cabal, any cabal that could be formed against him. So it was a miracle in a way, but
Right.
it was also not.
You're saying it's good politics. You want somebody.
It was politics. It was a lot of politics played into this.
Yeah. So you're saying you want someone with a clean slate, doesn't have allies. I get that. But again, if you read the simple story, it seems like they were taken by the interpretation. And like the language of the Barbanel says it more strongly than I forget the language, but he says, this is what's the big deal? Any kid can come up with this interpretation. And certainly in Egypt, where they had schools for dream interpretation, you wouldn't be admitted into the school without being able to translate this interpretation. Okay. So now we want to we want to really analyze the dreams and what Joseph interpreted. And of course, at the end, if you stick around long enough till 11 o'clock, hopefully we also think about what's the lesson for us. So we're not just here to think about ancient Egyptian dreams and interpretation, but we ultimately, if it's in the Torah, it's a lesson for each of us, which is where we're trying to get to. So we'll start the journey. We'll go to look at the actual verses. Now, there's so many different ways of reading this that it's like an hour is certainly not enough, and we have to figure out what we want to focus on. But I guess we have to start somewhere, so we'll do that. You know what? I'll open Rashi right away. Okay. So let's come in the morning. Now it comes to pass in the morning, he has the two dreams. Verse 8. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. Pharaoh is troubled. He realizes the dream had happened twice. There's a big deal here. Something is happening, and he's troubled. So he was sent and called all the necromancers of Egypt and all its sages, and Pharaoh related to them his dream. But no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. The Ein Potero Tana Pharaoh. No one interprets them for Pharaoh. Okay, what does that mean? Just say nobody can interpret them. What does it mean? No one can interpret them for Pharaoh. So here we have a fascinating Rashi. Rashi says they offered all kinds of interpretations. It's not that they didn't have interpretations. They offered interpretations. But no one interprets it for Pharaoh. No one could interpret it in a way that Pharaoh would be satisfied. Okay. Now we want to figure out what those other alternative interpretations were, because knowing what the alternative interpretations are will give us insight into what Joseph's genius is. So we have to figure out what the other people said to understand why they dropped the ball and why Joseph has the brilliant idea. So here we go. We have to look at Rashi. So I'm reading the Rashi. I think I'm highlighting it at the bottom of the page. But no one interpreted them for Pharaoh. So the shaded box is the Rashi. So Rashi explains that the extra words, no one interpreted for Pharaoh, could have just said Pharaoh told it to them and no one could interpret it. No, it says Pharaoh told it to them and no one could interpret it for Pharaoh. So Rashi says they did interpret them, but not for Pharaoh, for their voice did not reach his ears, and he had no satisfaction from their interpretation. In other words, they offered interpretations. He did not accept it. It didn't enter his ears. Pharaoh would not accept it. What did they say? And this is very interesting because this is the clue. We need clue. We're looking for clues of what Joseph's brilliance is. So one of the clues is what everyone else thinks it is. For they said, you will beget 7 daughters and you will bury 7 daughters. From Genesis Rabbah, from the Medrash. In other words, what do they say? The 7 fat cows, then 7 skinny cows, and the skinny cows swallow the fat cows. So, and the 7 healthy ears of grain and the 7 emaciated ears of grain, and the emaciated ones eat the healthy ones. So there are 7 good, 7 bad, the bad swallow the good. So what do they say? You're going to have 7 children, 7 daughters, that you're going to give birth to 7 daughters. I guess the Pharaoh has many wives, so it's not a problem, but you're also going to bury 7 daughters. Seems a fine interpretation to me, but Pharaoh says he does not accept that interpretation. Okay. So again, the elephant in the room, the cow in the room, pun intended, is why do the other people miss the point? What did they miss that Joseph can figure out? So we'll jump right in because enough introduction. And again, there's so many layers to angle this. So I'll first give an interpretation. I'm going to first give one stage of the interpretation, and then I'm going to come at it from another direction, and we'll see what happens. What's the problem with this interpretation? What does Joseph say? What's Joseph's big idea? Okay, big idea. What's his big idea? Okay, his big idea is that Pharaoh, in your dreams, cows, meaning objects, are what? Are units of time. That's the big idea. And that's what the other people cannot figure out. And there's 2 reasons why the other people can't figure out. First, I'll tell you what the Rebbe says, and then maybe later I'll give you my interpretation. But there's an obstacle. Those interpreters are not going to say that it's units of time. They're not going to say it. It's not an option. Okay, you know what? I'll start with mine. Why not? If you open up the media, and they get all the experts to predict the future, what's going to happen in the stock market. All the experts know this stock is going to go up, this stock is going to go down. They have people, these are really stargazers. These are really modern day dream interpreters, right? They're predicting the future. They get paid big bucks to come on television and tell you where the economy is going. And everybody listens to them. Okay, it's like what somebody once told me, that economists and meteorologists are the only 2 people who can get it wrong and still keep their job. So they said 2 feet of snow, it's 1 foot of snow. Okay, so the economy is going to go up, it's going to go down all day long. They're getting paid big bucks to interpret the future. They're no different than the dream interpreters of Pharaoh trying to interpret the future. Okay, let's think about the people who interpret the economy. They say the economy is going to go up. Okay, but please tell me when. If you tell me when, timing, if you tell me when it's going to go up, I'll be a rich man. Okay, it's going to go down. No problem. Just tell me when. Okay, but they're never going to tell you when. Why not? Because they don't know. And if they do know, and if they do tell you when, and it doesn't happen exactly then you realize that they're what they call in Yiddish, they're hacking and shining. They're just saying nonsense. So it's very easy to give interpretations and say something is going to happen. Why? Because you're not giving a time frame. I tell Pharaoh, 7 of your daughters are going to die. You can't prove me wrong. When are they going to die? They may die after you're dead, right? Eventually everybody dies, right? So timing, the Egyptians are not, Egyptians dream interpreters do not speak of time. It's a non-starter. They would never do it. Nobody would mention time. Joseph is very, very almost brave. He says there's going to be the economy. There's going to be 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, which means he's explaining this as units of time. Not only that, he tells Pharaoh even some more amazing. He tells Pharaoh that the reason why you had 2 dreams, even though it's the same dream, the second dream is the same message as the first dream. The reason why you had 2 dreams is because God is telling you that he's starting these years immediately. God is hastening to bring this about. Meaning, not only does he say there's going to have 7 good years and 7 bad years, but he's saying the 7 good years starts right now, starts this morning. The clock is ticking. Okay, so he puts his credibility on the line like nobody ever had. Okay, so Pharaoh is actually amazed by this concept that, wow, this person is not afraid. He's bold. He's not afraid to give an interpretation that ties him down to time. And no other Egyptian would ever do that. They would never say units of time. So what do they say? Oh, 7 girls are going to be born, 7 girls are going to die. When? Nobody knows, right? So that's Joseph's. That's why Joseph is so bold, and that's why Pharaoh says, "Wow, this is my guy. I'm impressed. Not only am I impressed, I'm going to give you the job because you're willing to take risk. You're bold. You seem to be confident in what you're doing. Unlike the other stargazers, where they're always saying things are going to happen sometime in the future. Well, I can't go to the bank with that. I can't go to my stockbroker with information that the stock market's going to go down. I know it's going to go down. Tell me when, please." Okay, so that's one interpretation. But now that's just cute. That's just to get us in the mood. Now we'll go to what the Rebbe said and see a much deeper element in this element, and in other words, much deeper concept, and then that teaches us the lesson. In other words, what we're trying to figure out is, why is everybody else blinded? Why are the interpreters of Egypt not mentioning time? They refuse to acknowledge that we're talking about units of time. So we have to go back to the verses, in addition to what I said, which is just a cute interpretation. But let's see, what the Rebbe says is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. At one point, you can't do this. The Talmud says you're not supposed to say this part of Torah is beautiful and this part of Torah is not beautiful. It's not supposed to do that. But at one point, this was the all-time most favorite teaching of the Rebbe that I enjoyed. Was this teaching for me? Just subjective, not again. That was just me. I'm not supposed to say it because, like I said, Torah, everything is sweet and everything is beautiful. But sometimes you relate to something more than others. So at some point, this was like the most beautiful talk I enjoyed. Okay, so what's the problem here? So the way the Rebbe learns this story is a problem. Here is the problem. So let's read verse 1, 2, 3, and verse 1, 2, 3 is enough to get the problem. It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh was dreaming, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. Verse 2, and behold, from the Nile were coming up 7 cows of handsome appearance and robust flesh, and they pastured in the marshland. Okay, wonderful. And behold, 7 other cows were coming up after them from the Nile, of ugly appearance and lean of flesh, and they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. Verse 4, and the cows of ugly appearance and lean flesh devoured the 7 cows that were of handsome appearance and healthy. Then Pharaoh awoke. That's dream 1. Dream 1 is enough. Why can't you say, what's the obstacle to say 7 fat cows is 7 good years, 7 skinny cows is 7 bad years? Why can't you say that? Why is that so hard to say? So the Rebbe's interpretation, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is it's alluded to in the end of verse 3. And they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. In other words, if the verse said that the ugly appearance cows emerged from the Nile and immediately swallowed up the fat cows, then you could say there's units of time. The reason why you can't say the units of time, because the end of verse 3, and remember, Pharaoh's giving a short description of the dream, but in the dream, you have both sets of cows standing next to each other together for a period of time. So the dream interpreters say this cannot be 7 years followed by 7 years, because how are they together? Right? If it's time, then first you have to have the fat cows and then the skinny cows. So the skinny cows have to emerge and swallow the fat cows immediately. But how could they both stand together? And they stood beside the cows which were on the Nile bank. For how long? I don't know, a minute, 10 minutes, a half an hour, it doesn't say. But they stood together. That's a significant part of the dream. So how could you say it's time? Because in time, the fat cows and the 7 cows are not together. First you have the fat cows, and then you have the 7 cows. And then you have first you have the fat cows, and then you have the emaciated cows. Okay. So how does Joseph solve this problem? And this is brilliant. What does Joseph say? Joseph says they're units of time. But why are the cows standing together? Because God is not only telling you the future. God is not only telling you how the economy is going to play out, that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. That's not what the dream is about. Pharaoh is assuming the dream is to tell me the future. No, that's not what the dream is about. The dream is not only about the problem. The dream is also giving you the solution. That's Pharaoh's idea. That's Joseph's idea. Joseph's idea is that God is giving you the solution in this dream. What's the solution? The solution is that during the years of plenty, store food for the years of famine. And during the years of famine, you enjoy the food from the years of plenty. So what happens according to Joseph's interpretation? You always have both years simultaneously, both sets simultaneously, because during the years of plenty, you're storing food for the years of famine. So you have both. I have the food for the years of plenty, and I have food for the years of famine. And during the 7 years of famine, I am eating from the food of plenty. So in other words, the fact that those cows are standing together represents not the prediction of what's going to happen, but the solution. Make sure that those 7 years and 7 years are not separate. Make sure they're intertwined. Make sure during the years of plenty you're saving for the years of famine, and during the years of famine you're eating from the food of plenty. Now this solves another big problem. We said, how could Joseph? He was asked to interpret the dream. How could he come up and start telling Pharaoh advice? This is what Pharaoh should do. Pharaoh should collect all the food of the grain, all the food from the 7 years, and store it for the 7 years of famine. Who asked you? Who asked you to give advice? Nobody hired you to give advice. It's not in your contract. You were advised to interpret the dream, not to give advice. What's the answer? The answer is this is Joseph's whole point. Joseph's whole point is that the dream is the advice. The advice is part of the dream interpretation. And that's why he gives the advice. Now, Pharaoh sees this. This is a breath of fresh air. Because as we're going to explain, when he sees that Joseph says that this dream is not only the problem, but it's also the solution, that's something that the Egyptians cannot think about. And that's what he's impressed with. That God is not only telling me what the problem is, but God is also giving me the solution. And within the dream that tells you the problem, there lies the seeds for the solution. That's a Jewish idea, as we will explain. And that's something that Pharaoh is impressed with. And he says, you know what, here are the keys, you take care of the economy. So that's stage one. I have to explain the last point of why he's so impressed. But at least we're starting to uncover what's happening. All the other Egyptian dream interpreters are not going to say that. They're not going to say that the objects and dreams are units of time. They're not going to say so. Why not? Number one, because My idea is because they don't want to lock themselves in. No economist tells you exactly what time the economy is going to turn around. If they knew, they wouldn't be economists. They would be investors. If they were so smart and they knew exactly how the economy is going to play out, they would have been billionaires, not TV pundits. So nobody wants to give you time. Nobody wants to give you the timing. But the deeper interpretation is they say, oh, let's go back to the 7 daughters and 7 sons. This is beautiful. 7 daughters you'll give birth to and 7 daughters will die. That can happen simultaneously. Pharaoh, Baruch Hashem, thank God, has many wives. Simultaneously, some could be born and others can die. It's not a problem. So you can have the joy of daughters being born and the pain of daughters dying. You can have that simultaneously. So the Egyptians say, wonderful. This is exactly what the dream is saying. The fat cows and the skinny cows are together. The mourning and the joy is together. But Pharaoh doesn't listen to that because Pharaoh senses that the dream is not about his personal life. It's about his role as a leader. It's about all of Egypt. But again, that point, the reason why they offer that interpretation, which seems far-fetched, 7 daughters will be born, 7 daughters will die. What's the brilliance? Let's give them some credit. Pharaoh's dream interpreters, they were the best in the ancient world. They were the best money could buy. So they obviously had some wisdom. So the Rebbe says, what did they figure out? They figured out we need an interpretation where the fat cows and the skinny cows can happen simultaneously. That could have the giving birth, daughters being born and daughters dying could happen simultaneously, and you're both happy and sad together. But again, what does Joseph realize? Joseph realized even though they're simultaneous, they still could be units of time. Even though units of time don't happen simultaneously, they happen one after the other. Yeah, but that's only if you're talking about the problem. If you're talking about the solution is that in the years of plenty, you have the years of famine. In the years of famine, you have the years of plenty. They're both together. So this is the first step in our interpretation. I'm biased. I think this is beautiful. If anybody has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we go further to unpack what's happening here. And eventually we have to bring it back home to us and what this means to us on this beautiful snowy day.
Rabbi, I have a quick question for you. Actually, it's not a quick question. I loved your interpretation about the dreams coming to Pharaoh. How come dreams didn't come to Pharaoh in the book of Exodus and tell him that he should really let the Jews go because otherwise he's going to get plagued and have his army destroyed and have his economy destroyed and the firstborn are going to die? Why doesn't God communicate to the Pharaoh of the book of Exodus?
That's a good question. Short answer, you want the short answer or the long answer?
The long answer.
Right. The short answer, I'll give you the short answer anyway. The short answer is I don't know. The long answer is that to dream is a form of prophecy. Right? Maimonides lists the forms of prophecy, and the dreams are the lowest form of prophecy, but it is a form of prophecy. So for God to communicate with you to a dream, for God to communicate to someone through a dream, that person has to be worthy, of some degree worthy of this revelation. In other words, you have to be open to spirituality. If you close your ears spiritually, you're not going to get a dream. God is not going to give you a dream because you're not going to listen anyway. So the prophecy to the Pharaoh of Exodus comes through the Jewish prophet who was interested in listening, which is Moshe. This Pharaoh is a nice guy. This Pharaoh actually is spiritually sensitive. This Pharaoh invites Joseph and his family, even though they're Hebrews, invites them in to Egypt and treats them well. This Pharaoh, when he sees that his economy is crashing, he's concerned with eating and drinking, but he's smart enough to know, let's appoint someone to help the people. So this person is not completely closed off spiritually. So he's worthy that God should communicate to him through a dream. Pharaoh, the book of Exodus, is a wicked person, and there's no reason for God to speak to him. If we need a communication for him, no problem. We'll send Moshe and Aaron. Even then, it doesn't work. So I think that the concept of who dreams, the spiritual person is dreaming. Who is the one that God is communicating through in the dream? It's the spiritual person. This Pharaoh, you have to be open, is what I'm trying to say. Now, not every dream is a prophecy. Even though every dream has a little bit of a prophecy, some of the dreams is just projections of what we think about during the day. But the point is, I think the answer is, I don't know the answer, but I think the answer is that you have to be a person who's open to dream. Some people just don't dream. I mean, some people just don't have that ability, that openness to accept the word of God, even in the form of a dream.
Rabbi, is it possible that the Egyptian sense of time and the Hebrew sense of time, their understanding of time is also different, which
Yes,
is
it
one
could very
reason
well be.
why the magicians of Egypt couldn't come up with it, because in their culture there was never there was something missing from what Joseph had access to.
So I would say a few things. I would say it a little bit different. The problem with their culture, the deficiency in their culture, which does not allow them to see what Joseph sees, I think is another point, which I'll get to in a minute. But if you want to talk about time and calendars, the Egyptians were relatively sophisticated when it comes to the calendar. I'm told, with the help of Google and Wikipedia, I'm told that they develop in addition to having a lunar calendar, they also have a solar calendar. Why do they need to have a solar calendar? Because they are very concerned they were concerned with agriculture. And for agriculture, you have to know the seasons. You see, if you're a shepherd, I don't want to get into this now, but you have the concept of a lunar calendar and a solar calendar. And a lunar calendar has a lot of advantages, because every night you go outside and you see the moon looks differently. The sun, it looks the same every day, and it moves only you don't always see, you can't see the differences from day to day in the sun's orbit, from, in other words, in the orbit from the position of the sun north or south. Day to day, you can't see the differences. With the moon, it's much easier to tell the difference. So the moon has advantages for time telling. The problem is that if you're an agriculture society, you have no benefit in the moon. You need the sun, because you have to know the seasons. You have to know when to plow and when to plant. So the Egyptians develop a solar calendar because they have the most advanced agriculture in the ancient world, and therefore they need to map the time. So as best as I know, they know what 7 years is. They know what 7 solar years is. They understand the concept of the solar calendar, because they're very connected to the agricultural cycle. As opposed to the Jews, who were more shepherds, the Hebrews were shepherds. They naturally were more connected to the lunar calendar, and only in the book of Exodus do we create the Jewish calendar, which is a hybrid of the lunar and the solar, which we'll get to in a few weeks. But I think that I do think that the Egyptians did have a strong sense of time. So that's what I think, but it could be I'm wrong. One more point I want to say about this, and I want to go a little back. Okay, let's go a little further. Why? Another reason I think why Joseph why Pharaoh was blown away by Joseph and say God is with you. He means the Jewish God, not the Egyptian God. So what's happening is like this. The culture of Egypt is a pagan culture. There are many gods. Each force of nature is considered a god, and human beings have very little power in the world. Everything that happens in the world, in the pagan view, is a result of the gods battling. In other words, if there's going to be a famine, it's because the god of famine overcomes the god of rain. Okay, and everything is determined. It's deterministic societies. So when Pharaoh hears that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, no Egyptian will say, here, I have advice how we can avert the disaster. Why would no Egyptian say that? Because in the Egyptian worldview, nothing you could do could influence the decisions of the gods. So if the gods decided that there's going to be 7 years of famine, you're doomed. What does Joseph say? Joseph says, look, God is showing you 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. And God is telling you, make sure those fat cows stand next to the skinny cows. The skinny cows stand next to the fat cows. Make sure you have enough grain from the fat years for the skinny years. God is telling you, do something to avert the disaster. No Egyptian could say that. The Jew can say that, because our understanding of God is not a God that determines what's going to happen in the world. It's a God that gives us free choice and empowers us to make the right decisions to better our circumstances. So Pharaoh says, wow, I have to hire you. why do I have to hire you? I cannot hire an Egyptian, because any Egyptian I hire for the task is going to fail, because they don't believe in the mission. So I'm going to hire an Egyptian. I say, Mr. Egyptian, your job is to do something to overcome the decree of the gods. The gods said there's going to be a famine, and your job is to make sure there'll be food when the gods said there's going to be famine. The Egyptian says, you're crazy. I can't do that. Nothing that I'm going to do is going to be successful. So the Egyptian cannot believe in this mission. Only a Jew, only a Hebrew, whose understanding of God is completely different, understanding of God who wants you to act, that's the person that Pharaoh says, wow, not only are you telling me that God is giving me a solution to a problem, but you're saying that God wants me to act and I'm going to solve the problem. Oh, only an outsider could believe this. Only an outsider could get this off the ground. So that's where I think that the Egyptian philosophy or Egyptian culture would fail to carry out this plan. If Pharaoh could not have hired an Egyptian to do this. No Egyptian believes in this message that God wants to bring a famine, but God is telling you that you could do something to avert the famine. If God didn't want a famine, he wouldn't bring a famine. The idea that God creates a situation and wants the human being through their own effort and through their own free choice to solve the problem, that's foreign to the Egyptian culture. And that's the essence of the Jewish culture. And that's why the Hebrew is the one who realizes this. And Pharaoh says, I've never seen a man with the Spirit of God within you, like Joseph. What's the big deal? You should put some money in your savings account. That's essentially what Joseph is saying, right? What's the big deal? But it's a big deal for that culture.
And this is also the idea of creating the cure before the illness.
Oh, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to go back to last parsha because there's one more section I have to do. It's just too fun. It's too much fun to miss. So let's talk about what Elisa just said. So, I'm sorry? March, what's that? This one? Let's talk about what Elisa just said. What's the message for us? The message for us is like this. We have challenges in our life. What is the message of Pharaoh's story, or of the story of the Pharaoh's dreams? The story of the Pharaoh's dreams is that within the message of the challenge, God is telling you the solution. God is telling you how to solve the problem. Right? What is God telling Pharaoh? He's not telling Pharaoh, by the way, we're having 7 years of famine, and there's nothing you're going to do about it. You're going to be destroyed. No. God says this is the challenge. But if you look carefully at the dream, if you look carefully at the challenge, you will realize that there's positivity here, right? The fat cows and the skinny cows are together. It's your choice whether you're going to find the good in the bad, because the good and the bad always come together. There's always the opportunity for healing within the challenge. And that is a very Jewish idea. And that's the idea relevant to us, because everybody, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but everybody is going to experience 7 challenging years, right? In other words, it's some form or another of a challenge, a physical challenge, a spiritual challenge, a health challenge, whatever kind of challenge. Everybody has a challenge. What Joseph gives us, that Joseph teaches us, is that God, whenever God sends the challenge, God also sends us the power to overcome the challenge. And we have to be able to find that within ourselves and within the circumstance, and be able to grow from the experience, and not be like the Egyptians and realize that there's nothing we can do about it. It's determined, and we have no space to heal. And the healing is embedded in the challenge. That's the big idea, which we can elaborate upon, but that's the big idea. Okay, that's it for today. Now, with the next 14 minutes, I want to take you on a journey back last week and tell you, maybe, perhaps, how God helped Joseph reach this solution. Because remember that this is not the first dreams Joseph interpreted. Last week's parsha, Joseph interpreted the dreams of the baker and the butler. And whatever Joseph said happened. God said, Joseph told the butler that Pharaoh will bring you back to your position, and that's what happened. And Joseph told the baker that Pharaoh would kill you, and that's what happened. Now, why do I have to know the details of all the dreams? I don't know. But there is a theory out there that those dreams were really a prelude to the dreams of Pharaoh. In other words, those dreams are the dreams that teach Joseph how to think about dream interpretations. So everything I told you so far about how Joseph interpreted the dreams, everything I told you could be found also in Joseph's interpretation of the dreams of the baker and the butler of last week's Parsha. So this is just entertainment. In other words, we already got the big picture. We got the solution. We have all the answers to our questions. We have the lesson. Now we want to see how Joseph got to this. It's also important to understand why the Torah gives us so much elaboration of the other dreams. The Torah could have just said, there were two ministers, Joseph gave the interpretation, one, whatever Joseph said happened, and live happily ever after. Instead, we get all the details of the dream and all the details of Joseph's interpretations. And again, this may be what led Joseph to be able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. So if you're still here, the journey continues. So I'm going to the 7th reading of last week's Parsha. Now it came about after these events that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker sinned against their master, against the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh became incensed at his two chamberlains, at the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He puts them in prison, and he placed them in the prison of the house of the chief of the slaughterers, into the prison, the place where Joseph was imprisoned. Okay, I'm going to 5. Now, both of them dreamt a dream, each one his dream on the same night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Joseph came to them in the morning, and he saw them, and behold, they were troubled. And he asked Pharaoh's chamberlains, who were with him in the prison of his master's house, saying, why are your faces sad today? Long story short, they said, we have a dream. So now they start telling Joseph their dreams. So here we go. So the chief cupbearer related his dream to Joseph, and he said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine is before me. And on the vine, there are 3 tendrils, and it seemed to be blossoming, and its buds came out. Then its clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. So beautiful. He says, I see a vine. The vine has 3 branches, and it gives birth to grapes. And I squeeze the grapes, and I give the cup to Pharaoh. Joseph says, beautiful. And Joseph said to him, this is the meaning of 3 tendrils are 3 days. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will number you. In other words, he will recount you with the other officers, and he will restore you to your position. And you place Pharaoh, and you will place Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to your previous custom when you were his cupbearer. And then he says, remind me and mention me to Pharaoh. We're going to skip that. Now, the baker says, wow, wonderful. What a positive dream interpretation. 3 days, you're out of prison. You're back to your previous position. Let me give it a shot. So now the chief baker saw that he had interpreted well. So he said to Joseph, me too, in my dream, behold, there were 3 wicker baskets on my head. And in the toppermost basket was all kinds of Pharaoh's food, the work of a baker, and the birds were eating them from the basket atop my head. And Joseph replied and said, this is the meaning. The 3 baskets represents the 3 days. In another 3 days, and this becomes very negative, in another 3 days, Pharaoh will remove your head from you and hang you on the gallows, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you. Wonderful, very inspiring. Verse 20, now it came about on the 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday, that the Pharaoh made a feast for all his servants, and he counted the chief cupbearer and the baker among his servants, etc. Whatever Joseph said happened. Okay, do I need all these details? Seriously, do I need all these details? One theory is yes, you need all these details. You go back to verse 12, and verse 12 is everything we've been talking about in the last 51 minutes. Joseph said to him, this is its meaning. The 3 tendrils are 3 days. What does that mean? Objects are units of time. In 3 more days, Pharaoh will recount you. Joseph knows that Pharaoh's birthday is 3 days away. He sees 3 tendrils, 3 branches. He says 3 branches are 3 days. Now go back to, that's the first thing he says. That's his big idea. His big idea, objects are equivalent to time. And that's exactly what he says to the baker as well. Look at 18. The first thing he tells the baker in 18. And Joseph replied and said, this is its meaning. The 3 baskets represent 3 days. Now that he realized that, Pharaoh's birthday is in 3 days. And Pharaoh's birthday, there's a party. When there's a party, there's activity. Then Pharaoh likes to think about who's in prison, who mention all of his ministers, and then he'll remember you. So that's almost more, that's easier to get to that interpretation. 3 objects, 3 days. Pharaoh's birthday is 3 days away. Joseph gets his main point. This is Joseph's big trick. It's not the first time he did it in Mikate in our Parsha. The first time he did it was the end of last Parsha. Objects are days. Okay, beautiful, wonderful. That's step 1. We're not done yet. Step number 2. How does Joseph know that the first dream, the butler is going to be restored back to his previous position, whereas the baker is going to be hanged? How does he go from one extreme? How does he know one's positive, one's negative? Okay, so the birds are eating the bread on the top of the basket. Joseph says, that means the bird is going to eat your flesh. Who said so? Maybe the bird is the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh will eat your basket. How does Joseph know from looking at these dreams that the first one, the butler is a positive dream, and the baker is a negative dream? How does Joseph know? So one theory, and this is a beautiful theory in my opinion, one theory is, it's very simple. In the dream, the butler is active. In the dream, the baker is passive, right? If you look at verse 11, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into the Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm. There's activity. The butler is doing something. Contrast that to the baker at the bottom of the page, 17. And on the toppermost basket were all kinds of Pharaoh's food, the work of a baker, not even my work, the work of a baker, and the birds were eating them from the basket atop my head. What is he doing? 0, nothing. What does Joseph say? The person who's active is alive. It's a positive dream. The person who's passive is dead. There's nothing happening here. 3 days, you're dead. And that's what happens, and that's what happens. And that's what Joseph says, and that's what happens. What's the takeaway from that dream? Pharaoh sees a dream. Joseph tells Pharaoh, it's your choice whether it's a good dream or a bad dream. If you're passive, if you do nothing, it's going to be a disaster for Egypt. If you're active, and that's what he says, if you appoint someone to gather all the grain of Egypt, then it could be a good dream. So you see both elements that Joseph tells Pharaoh, Joseph really got in the previous story. He gets the 2 main points. Number 1, that a dream, the main point is that an object in a dream could be a unit of time. And number 2, you have to be active. And that's what he tells Pharaoh. And to us, that sounds obvious, but in Egyptian culture, that is completely contrary to everything they believe. Human beings cannot change the course of history. The human beings can change whatever the gods determine. And Joseph says, no, you must be active. And of course, the answer, the lesson to us is that in any given situation, any negative situation, if we accept the challenge as it is, if we accept the hardship, it's not going to be a positive dream. But if we ask the question of what can we do, what are we called to do in response to this scenario, that's when the dream becomes positive. I'm going to conclude with interpretation, which I said before, the beautiful interpretation from Shamshon Hirsch, Rabbi Shamshon Hirsch, 19th century rabbi of Germany. He says as follows. He says, if you look at Psalms, verse 18, King David says, Eli, Eli, lama zavtani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that becomes a famous phrase in other faiths, in other religions. And it's a big question. You say, God, why have you forsaken me? He says, if you look at the Hebrew grammar, it's not lama. It's not why have you forsaken me. Very subtle. Not lama, but lima. Same words. The vowel is a little bit different. Not lama, why, but lima, for what? Meaning to say, if I feel God forsakes me, the question I have to ask is not, why, God, have you forsaken me? But for what? For what purpose? What am I called to do? What do you want me to do? And that's the essential difference between the Jew and the Egyptian. The Egyptian says, God has forsaken me. God has sent famine. God is sending a challenge. What am I going to do? I sit with my hands folded and I wait for the disaster to strike because nothing I can do could change. And the same thing is with my own internal challenges. If I have an internal challenge, if I'm challenged internally with my own negativity, what could I do? This is the way God created me. What do you want me to do? So I succumb to my own temptation. I succumb to my own negativity. But if you're like Joseph, if you have the Jewish view, then, like Samson here says, God, you've forsaken me. God, you give me a challenge, but lema, for what? What am I called on to do? What do you want me to do in this situation? That's the question to ask. So the question to ask is always an active question. What am I called upon to do? If you'll be like that, you'll be like Joseph. And Joseph not only helps Egypt, but he helps himself and he helps his family, and it saves the Jewish people from famine. So this is just a little tip of the iceberg of what's happening in this week's Parsha. We didn't even get to the second reading, let alone the whole story with Joseph and his brothers. Maybe we'll get to that next week. But the dreams are just so fascinating because how you interpret dreams says so much about your own worldview, even more than about the dreams. In other words, the fact that Pharaoh's Egyptian dream interpreters cannot interpret it, and Joseph could, is not because Joseph is smarter than them. They're certainly very smart, and they certainly have been doing this for a very long time. But the point is, it's a reflection of their own values and their own perspective on life and their own perspective of God. And of course, that's the lesson to us. We all are like Joseph, and Joseph leads the way that when there's a challenge, look within the dream, look within the challenge, and you'll find a solution, and you'll find God directing you to what you have to do to not only survive the situation, but to better the situation, to become a better person and to create the salvation. So this is the story in short, ladies and gentlemen. Because it's a snow day, we'll finish one day early, so you have more time to play in the snow. Everybody have a wonderful day. If you have any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, a wonderful Hanukkah. It's tonight is the last night of Hanukkah. Tomorrow is the last day of Hanukkah. We have a full menorah tonight, full of light. Then we got to keep the light for the rest of the year. Thank you so much for joining.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
And also,
Thank you, Rabbi. Wonderful.
Thank you, Rabbi Yeshua.
Thank you.
Question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you, Karina. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.